The pen scratched against paper with the methodical precision of someone who had written 1,000 mission reports. Lieutenant Commander Vesper Nakamura sat in the back corner of the briefing room, her flight suit rumpled from a red-eye transport, scribbling notes that had nothing to do with the emergency meeting unfolding around her. While 47 other pilots shifted restlessly in their seats, she sketched the wing configuration of an F-35C Lightning II from memory, adding structural stress calculations in the margins. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was redesigning the very aircraft that had ended her career 6 months ago. Captain Morrison's voice cut through the restless murmur like a blade through silk. At 3:47 hours this morning, we lost contact with Strike Package Delta over the Strait of Hormuz. The room fell silent. Vesper's pen stopped moving. She knew that callsign, Commander Jake Reaper Walsh, her former squadron leader, the man who had recommended her discharge after the incident. Initial reports suggest mechanical failure, but satellite imagery shows what appears to be coordinated hostile activity in the vicinity. The captain's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on faces weathered by combat and younger ones still hungry for their first real engagement. We need experienced pilots for immediate deployment, combat veterans only. Hands shot up throughout the room like a forest of certainty. Vesper remained motionless, her notebook open to a page covered in aerodynamic calculations and a single word written in Arabic script: redemption. The mission parameters are classified, but I'll be direct. This isn't a training exercise. We're looking at potential engagement with unknown hostiles using advanced jamming technology. Radio silence protocols will be in effect. Visual confirmation only. Morrison paused, studying the eager faces before him. If any pilot here doesn't have actual combat experience, now's the time to speak up. The silence stretched like a held breath. Vesper felt the weight of 47 pairs of eyes, some curious, others dismissive. They knew her story, the decorated fighter pilot who had frozen during a critical engagement, cost her wingman his aircraft, and been quietly shuffled to a desk job designing training protocols. The woman who had gone from ghost to grounded in the span of 30 seconds over hostile airspace. She closed the notebook with a soft snap that seemed to echo in the stillness. The sketch of the Lightning II disappeared behind worn leather, but the calculations remained burned in her mind. Thrust ratios, G-force tolerances, the exact angle of attack needed to execute a split-S maneuver in a compromised aircraft. Knowledge earned through failure, refined through shame, perfected through months of relentless analysis of what had gone wrong. Captain Morrison's question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Combat pilots. Vesper's hand rose slowly, steadily, while her other hand gripped the notebook that contained the solution to a problem none of them knew they were about to face. The emergency klaxon began to wail 15 minutes later. By then, everything had changed, and the woman they called Notebook was about to remind them why she had once been the most feared pilot in the Pacific Fleet. The transport bay erupted into controlled chaos as pilots sprinted toward their assigned aircraft. Vesper moved with deliberate calm, her notebook tucked into her chest pocket like a talisman. Around her, younger pilots shouted coordinates and checked weapon systems with the nervous energy of those about to prove themselves. She had already proven herself once, and failed spectacularly when it mattered most. Her assigned F-35C sat in Bay 7, pristine and deadly under the harsh fluorescent lights. The ground crew chief, a weathered master sergeant named Rodriguez, looked up from his checklist with barely concealed skepticism. "Ma'am, this bird's been configured for air-to-air combat. Full missile loadout, upgraded radar suite. You sure you're ready for this?" Vesper ran her hand along the aircraft's wing, feeling the slight imperfections in the composite skin where stress fractures might develop under high-G maneuvers. "Tell me about the maintenance history, Sergeant. Any issues with the hydraulic pressure sensors during aggressive banking?" Rodriguez blinked, surprised by the specificity of her question. "Actually, yes, ma'am. We've had intermittent warnings during sharp turns above 8 GS. Nothing that should affect normal flight operations, but it could cause control lag during evasive maneuvers if the pilot doesn't compensate for the delay. Vesper opened her notebook, flipping to a page covered with hydraulic system diagrams. Increase the pressure by 12% before takeoff. The lag will disappear. The sergeant stared at the calculations, recognition dawning in his eyes. You're the one who wrote the new maintenance protocols, the ones that cut our mechanical failures by 60%. She was already climbing into the cockpit, her movements economical and precise. That's what happens when you have too much time and too many bad memories, Sergeant. The canopy began to lower. Now let's see if theory translates to practice. Across the bay, Lieutenant Maverick Johnson, call sign earned through reckless confidence rather than skill, was regaling his ground crew with tales of his simulator scores. Ghost might have been hot shit once, he said, voice carrying in the metallic space, but sitting behind a desk writing manuals doesn't exactly keep your edge sharp. Vesper's radio crackled to life as she completed her pre-flight checks. Delta Formation, this is Tower. You are cleared for immediate departure. Mission Commander will brief en route. Weather conditions optimal, wind from the southwest at 15 knots. She listened to the younger pilots acknowledge orders with crisp military precision, their voices tight with anticipation. When her turn came, she keyed her mic once. Ghost, ready. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds too long. Then Morrison's voice cut through the frequency. Good to have you back in the air, Ghost. The past tense in his words wasn't lost on anyone. The 6 aircraft launched in perfect formation, their afterburners painting orange trails across the pre-dawn sky. Vesper flew tail-end Charlie, the position typically reserved for the least experienced pilot in the formation. Standard protocol dictated that the most skilled aviators take point and wingman positions, leaving the rear guard to those who needed protection rather than those capable of providing it. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, the mission parameters came through encrypted channels. Strike Package Delta, 3 F-35CS, and a reconnaissance drone had been patrolling international waters when their transponders went dark simultaneously. Last known position placed them 70 nautical miles southeast of a cluster of disputed islands, where intelligence had recently detected unusual electromagnetic activity. Ghost, maintain current heading and altitude, Morrison's voice crackled through her headset. You're our eyes and ears back there. If something goes sideways, we need you to break off and return to base with intel. Translation: when things got dangerous, she was expected to run while the real pilots handled business. Vesper adjusted her grip on the controls, feeling the aircraft respond to the slightest pressure. The notebook pressed against her ribs with each breath, a reminder of 6 months spent analyzing not just mechanical failures, but the human error that had cost Lieutenant Marcus Chen his aircraft and nearly his life. The official report had blamed equipment malfunction. The unofficial whispers blamed the pilot who had hesitated when split-second decisions meant the difference between survival and statistics. Vesper knew the truth was more complicated than either version, but truth had little weight compared to the opinions of men who had never experienced that particular kind of failure. Ahead, the formation maintained perfect spacing as they approached the coordinates of Delta's last known position. The ocean below stretched endlessly, deceptively peaceful under the morning sun. But Vesper's eyes weren't on the water. They were scanning the electromagnetic spectrum readout on her display, watching for the subtle anomalies she had learned to recognize during months of studying sensor data. At 18,000 feet, the first irregularity appeared. A brief flutter in their communication array, so quick that most pilots would dismiss it as atmospheric interference. Vesper opened her notebook to a page marked M Warfare Signatures and began to compare the pattern against her handwritten notes. The answer was there, hidden in the data like a whisper in a storm. Someone was watching them, and they had technology she had seen before. The radio silence stretched for another 10 minutes before Lieutenant Johnson broke protocol. "Tower, this is Maverick. I'm not seeing anything out here except blue water and our own shadows. Maybe Delta just had a navigation malfunction and limped home through a different route." Captain Morrison's response carried the weight of command and the edge of controlled tension. "Negative, Maverick. Continue sweep pattern Alpha. Ghost, report status." Vesper's fingers hovered over her transmit button as she studied the electromagnetic readings that painted an increasingly clear picture across her displays. The patterns were subtle, sophisticated, and definitely not natural atmospheric phenomena. More importantly, they matched signatures she had encountered once before, during the engagement that had destroyed her reputation and nearly killed her wingman. "Tower Ghost, reading faint M anomalies bearing 095, intermittent but consistent with active jamming protocols." She paused, knowing her next words would change everything. "Pattern matches known hostile stealth technology." The formation's chatter died instantly. Through her headset, she could hear the collective intake of breath from 5 other pilots as they processed the implications. If she was right, they weren't searching for crashed friendlies. They were flying into a carefully orchestrated ambush using technology that could render their most advanced systems useless. "Ghost, confirm your last." Morrison's voice had dropped to the tone reserved for life-and-death communications. Vesper looked down at her notebook, at 6 months of obsessive research condensed into pages of calculations and tactical analysis. Everything she had learned about electronic warfare, stealth technology, and the art of making advanced aircraft disappear from radar screens. Knowledge purchased with shame and refined through isolation. "Tower Ghost confirms, we're not alone out here." The acknowledgement came as 5 aircraft simultaneously began defensive maneuvers, their formation dissolving into a complex dance of evasion and mutual protection. All except one. Vesper maintained her heading and altitude, her eyes locked on displays showing electromagnetic signatures that told a story the others couldn't read. Someone had to be the bait, someone had to draw them out, and someone had to be ready for what came next. The attack began exactly as her analysis had predicted. At 8:47 hours, Lieutenant Johnson's aircraft simply vanished from radar, not destroyed, not damaged, but electronically erased as if it had never existed. His radio calls turned to static, then silence. Through the tactical frequency, the remaining pilots could hear Morrison coordinating search patterns while trying to maintain mission objectives that no longer made sense. "All call signs, this is Tower. Maverick has gone dark. Switch to secondary frequencies and maintain visual contact with wingmen." Vesper watched the electromagnetic patterns shift and intensify, painting a 3-dimensional picture of hostile forces that remained invisible to conventional sensors. Her notebook's pages fluttered in the cockpit's airflow as she cross-referenced signatures with tactical responses she had spent months developing. The enemy was using a combination of technologies: advanced stealth coatings, directed electromagnetic pulse weapons, and what appeared to be adaptive camouflage systems that bent radar waves around aircraft like water around stones. "Ghost, break left and climb to Angels 25. We need overwatch while we search for Maverick." Instead of acknowledging immediately, Vesper rolled her aircraft into a shallow dive, following an intercept course that appeared to take her directly toward empty ocean. Her displays showed what the others couldn't see: 3 hostile aircraft maintaining perfect formation 2,000 feet below them, using the electromagnetic interference they generated to mask their approach. "Tower Ghost is going hunting." She didn't wait for permission. The dive carried her through layers of increasingly dense electronic interference until her own radar became unreliable. But she didn't need radar now. She needed the Mark I eyeball and the instincts that had once made her the most successful pilot in carrier-based operations. Through the canopy, She caught the brief glint of sunlight on metal, there, and gone like a camera flash. Her first missile launch was pure instinct, fired not at a target she could see, but at coordinates calculated from electromagnetic signatures and geometric probability. The AIM-120 streaked downward into apparent empty sky, its contrail writing a white question mark against blue canvas. The explosion, when it came, revealed a Chinese J-20 fighter disintegrating in a cloud of fire and debris. Advanced stealth technology scattered across the ocean's surface like expensive confetti. "Holy shit, Ghost actually nailed one." Johnson's voice crackled back onto the frequency, his aircraft flickering back into radar coverage as the jamming field collapsed. But Vesper was already banking hard right, pursuing electromagnetic ghosts that her instruments showed, but her eyes couldn't yet confirm. The notebook's calculations had been correct. The enemy was using coordinated jamming to hide a full squadron of advanced fighters. And now that she had revealed their positions, they were no longer interested in remaining hidden. The sky erupted into a three-dimensional chess game played at Mach speeds, where wrong moves meant death and hesitation, meant watching friends disappear into clouds of shrapnel and burning fuel. The dogfight that followed would be studied in tactical warfare colleges for decades. 6 American F-35CS against an estimated 12 Chinese J-20s, fought in airspace where traditional radar was useless and electronic warfare made communication sporadic at best. But while her squadron mates flew by instinct and training, Vesper flew by knowledge, knowledge written in a notebook that had become her obsession and now served as her tactical Bible. Tower Ghost, multiple hostiles bearing 270, altitude Angels 18. They're using rotating frequency jamming, every 45 seconds, different spectrum. Her voice remained steady as she pulled 8GS in a climbing turn, blood pooling in her lower extremities while she tracked targets that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Recommend attack pattern Gamma 7 during frequency rotation windows. Morrison's acknowledgement came through bursts of static as the formation adapted to her guidance. What had begun as a search and rescue mission had evolved into the most complex air-to-air engagement in decades, fought by pilots who couldn't rely on the technology that usually kept them alive. Lieutenant Commander Sarah, Viper, Blackwood found herself flying wing to the woman she had quietly dismissed as a washed-up desk jockey. "Ghost, how the hell are you seeing them when my displays are showing nothing but electromagnetic soup?" Vesper's response came between missile launches and defensive maneuvers that seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened. 6 months of studying how they think, Viper, patterns in the chaos. She rolled inverted and dove toward what appeared to be empty ocean, trusting calculations over instruments. Her second kill came when she fired into seemingly vacant sky and watched another J-20 materialize around her missile like a magic trick in reverse. The tide of battle shifted as the American formation adapted to fighting blind, using Vesper's electromagnetic analysis to coordinate attacks against enemies they couldn't see. What should have been a massacre became a tactical demonstration of how knowledge could overcome superior numbers when applied with surgical precision. When the smoke cleared and the last hostile signatures faded from her displays, 5 American aircraft remained airborne. The 6th, Lieutenant Johnson's fighter, had suffered minor damage but was flying home under its own power. Against odds that any reasonable analysis would have called impossible, they had not only survived but achieved tactical superiority against a technologically advanced enemy force. "All call signs, this is Tower. Outstanding work out there. Ghost." Morrison's pause carried the weight of recognition and perhaps something approaching apology. "That was some of the finest tactical flying I've witnessed in 23 years of service." Vesper looked down at her notebook, now filled with real-time combat notes and electromagnetic signatures that would reshape electronic warfare doctrine. The pen that had scratched against paper in obscurity had written the blueprint for victory against impossible odds. The aircraft carrier's deck rose to meet them through morning haze, its massive bulk a reassuring sight after 3 hours of combat over hostile waters. As they entered the landing pattern, Vesper could see emergency crews positioned along the runway, standard protocol for aircraft returning from engagement. But the visible tension suggested they hadn't been certain any of the squadron would return at all. Lieutenant Commander Blackwood's voice came through the frequency, professional but carrying an undertone of genuine curiosity. "Ghost, request permission to buy you a drink once we're wheels down. I'd like to understand how you were tracking targets when the rest of us were flying blind." "Copy that, Viper, but first rounds are on me." Vesper aligned her approach with practiced precision, the carrier deck growing larger through her canopy. "It's the least I can do for squadron mates who trusted a grounded pilot with their lives." The landing was textbook perfect, Hook catching the 3-wire with exactly the right combination of speed and angle. As her aircraft rolled to a stop, Vesper could see Captain Morrison waiting beside the tower, his expression unreadable beneath his service cover. Behind him stood Admiral Richardson, the battle group commander whose presence meant this debriefing would involve pay grades significantly above her current station. She climbed down from the cockpit with her notebook still tucked against her chest, its pages now containing the most detailed analysis of advanced electronic warfare tactics in recent military history. The ground crew that had prepared her aircraft 6 hours earlier now looked at her with something approaching reverence. The same faces that had questioned her readiness now studying her with the careful attention reserved for pilots who had just redefined what was possible. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Commander." Admiral Richardson's words carried the authority of someone who had commanded carrier battle groups through 3 decades of evolving threats. "Your tactical analysis turned what could have been a catastrophic loss into a decisive victory. I'm told you've been developing new approaches to electronic warfare while on administrative duty." Vesper held up the notebook, its leather cover worn smooth from months of constant use. "6 months of studying patterns, sir. Signal analysis, frequency rotation protocols, electromagnetic signature recognition. I had time to think about what went wrong during my last engagement and how to prevent it from happening again." The Admiral took the notebook, flipping through pages covered with technical diagrams, mathematical equations, and tactical observations written in Vesper's precise handwriting. His expression shifted from polite interest to genuine surprise as he processed the depth of analysis contained within. "This is graduate-level work, Lieutenant Commander. Some of these calculations. Where did you learn this approach to stealth detection?" "Trial and error, sir. Mostly error." Vesper's voice carried no self-pity, only the flat honesty of someone who had looked failure directly in the eyes and learned from the experience. "When you're responsible for a wingman getting shot down, you have strong motivation to understand exactly how things can go wrong in combat." The truth hung in the salt air between them like a challenge waiting to be acknowledged. Everyone present knew her history, the decorated pilot who had frozen during a critical engagement, whose moment of hesitation had cost her wingman his aircraft and nearly his life. But they also now knew what she had done with the shame and isolation that followed. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching professional admiration. "Lieutenant Commander, I'm recommending you for immediate reinstatement to active flight status. Your analysis today prevented what could have been the loss of an entire squadron." Vesper looked out across the carrier deck, where maintenance crews were already preparing aircraft for the next launch cycle. The endless rhythm of military readiness that never paused, never forgave, and rarely offered second chances to those who had failed when failure meant lives lost. She thought about Lieutenant Chen, her former wingman, now flying cargo runs in Alaska because his injuries prevented him from returning to fighter operations. About the 6 months of administrative duty that had felt like professional purgatory, but had given her the time and motivation to understand electronic warfare in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. The notebook's weight against her chest reminded her that knowledge earned through failure often proved more valuable than wisdom gained through success. Sometimes you had to fall completely before you could learn to fly. The squadron debriefing took place in a secured conference room where classified mission details could be discussed without concern for unauthorized surveillance. Vesper sat at the far end of the table, her notebook open to pages covered with real-time combat observations and electromagnetic signatures that had proven accurate enough to save lives. Admiral Richardson presided over the session with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that today's tactical lessons would determine tomorrow's survival rates. Let's start with the electromagnetic warfare aspects. Ghost, walk us through how you identified hostile positions when conventional radar was compromised. She stood and moved to the digital display board, her movements carrying the unconscious confidence of someone explaining a subject they had mastered through obsessive study. The enemy was using adaptive frequency jamming, constantly shifting their interference patterns to stay ahead of our filtering algorithms. But they made one critical error. They maintained consistent power levels across all frequencies. Her stylus traced patterns across the screen that looked like abstract art, but represented life-and-death intelligence to pilots who might face similar threats. By tracking power distribution rather than frequency content, you can identify the source location even when you can't penetrate the jamming itself. It's like trying to find someone in a crowded room when everyone's shouting. You can't hear individual voices, but you can still identify where each person is standing by measuring sound intensity. Lieutenant Blackwood leaned forward, studying the calculations with genuine interest. How did you develop this approach? This isn't standard electronic warfare doctrine. It came from analyzing my failure 6 months ago. Vesper's voice carried no emotion, just the flat precision of someone reporting technical facts. When Lieutenant Chen and I engaged hostile forces over the Spratly Islands, I froze because I couldn't distinguish between hostile signatures and electronic interference. I spent the following month studying why conventional detection methods fail under advanced jamming conditions. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. The woman they had considered a cautionary tale about combat stress had actually been developing revolutionary tactics while serving her administrative sentence. Her failure hadn't broken her. It had motivated her to solve problems that the military's best minds considered unsolvable. Captain Morrison consulted his mission notes, then looked directly at Vesper. Your recommendations for engaging enemies using coordinated stealth technology. She flipped to a new page in her notebook, revealing diagrams that showed attack formations optimized for electronic warfare environments. Traditional tactics assume you can see your targets and communicate with your wingmen. When both assumptions fail, you need to fight like submarine crews, using passive detection, predetermined coordination signals, and mathematical probability rather than visual confirmation. Admiral Richardson nodded slowly, recognizing tactical innovation when he encountered it. I'm authorizing immediate classification and distribution of these methods to fleet combat squadrons. How long would you need to develop a formal training protocol? It's already written, sir. Vesper opened her notebook to reveal 300 pages of detailed analysis, tactical procedures, and training exercises. I've had plenty of time to be thorough. The weight of recognition settled over the room like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. The pilot they had written off as a casualty of combat stress had actually been developing the next generation of air warfare tactics. 3 weeks later, Vesper stood before a different kind of briefing room, this one filled with test pilots, tactical analysts, and electronic warfare specialists who had come from across the Pacific Fleet to learn her methods. The notebook that had been her private obsession was now a classified tactical manual being studied by the military's most experienced aviators. The key principle, she explained to an audience that included officers several ranks above her, is understanding that advanced stealth technology creates patterns even when it's designed to hide them. Every jamming protocol, every adaptive camouflage system, every electronic countermeasure generates signatures that can be detected if you know what to look for and where to find it. Her presentation included footage from the engagement 3 weeks earlier, showing how electromagnetic analysis had enabled accurate targeting against invisible enemies. The tactical victory had been complete, 6 hostile aircraft destroyed with 0 friendly losses, achieved by a squadron that had been flying essentially blind throughout the engagement. Questions? Vesper looked across the room at faces that now studied her with professional respect rather than polite skepticism. A commander from Electronic Attack Squadron 134 raised his hand. "Ma'am, this approach requires pilots to process complex mathematical calculations during high-stress combat situations. How do you train aviators to perform this kind of analysis while pulling GS and dodging missiles?" She smiled for the first time in months, thinking about the countless hours she had spent translating complex theory into simple procedures that could be executed under combat stress. "The same way you train them to land on a carrier deck at night in rough seas, Commander. Practice until the calculations become instinct." The room buzzed with the kind of intellectual excitement that accompanied genuine tactical breakthroughs. These were professionals who understood that the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application often determined who went home and who became statistics. Admiral Richardson stood from his position at the back of the room. "Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, effective immediately, you're being assigned as lead instructor for advanced electronic warfare tactics. Your training protocols will become standard curriculum for all fleet combat squadrons." Vesper felt the weight of rehabilitation settling on her shoulders, heavier than shame, more complex than simple vindication. She had been given a chance to transform her failure into doctrine that would save lives and change how America's pilots fought in an era of increasingly sophisticated enemies. That evening, she sat in her quarters writing a letter that would never be sent. "Dear Chen," it began, "I finally figured out what went wrong that day, and more importantly, how to make sure it never happens again." The pen moved across paper with the same methodical precision that had characterized her note-taking 6 months earlier. But now, the words carried the weight of proven tactics rather than theoretical speculation. Outside her window, aircraft launched for night training missions using procedures she had developed. The sound of jet engines echoed across the carrier deck like a mechanical lullaby, the rhythm of readiness that never paused. The transformation from grounded to ghost had taken 6 months of isolation, obsessive study, and the kind of professional humility that came from understanding exactly how close she had come to losing everything. But redemption, when it finally arrived, felt less like victory than like the resumption of interrupted service to something larger than personal reputation. Her notebook lay open beside the unfinished letter, its pages filled with the mathematical poetry of electronic warfare and the practical wisdom that came from turning failure into tactical advantage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the best pilots were those who had learned to fly again after falling from the sky. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond her window, holding secrets that would require new kinds of courage to uncover. 6 months after her return to active duty, Lieutenant Commander Vesper Nakamura stood on the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific in shades of gold and amber. The notebook that had once been her private repository of shame and analysis now existed in multiple copies throughout the fleet, a classified tactical manual that bore her name as primary author. "Ghost, you're cleared for launch. Training mission parameters have been uploaded to your navigation system. The voice belonged to her former student, Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had mastered her electronic warfare techniques well enough to become an instructor himself. She climbed into the cockpit of her F-35C with movements that had become ritual rather than routine. The aircraft bore new sensor modifications based on her recommendations, enhanced electromagnetic detection arrays, and improved signal processing software that could identify stealth signatures in real time. Technology inspired by failure, refined through study, and proven in combat. The takeoff carried her into skis where new pilots now trained using procedures she had developed, while serving her sentence of administrative duty. Below, the carrier battle group maintained formation with the mechanical precision of units that had learned to fight enemies they couldn't see using tactics that hadn't existed a year earlier. At 10,000 feet, she opened her communication channel to the frequency used by advanced training squadrons. Delta Flight, this is Ghost. Today we're practicing electronic warfare engagement protocols against simulated stealth targets. Remember, your instruments will lie to you, your radar will show you ghosts, and your enemy will try to convince you that empty sky is actually empty. The responses came from pilots young enough to consider her method standard doctrine rather than revolutionary innovation. They hadn't lived through the transition from conventional warfare to electronic chaos. For them, fighting invisible enemies was simply part of being a naval aviator in the modern era. Copy that, Ghost. Delta 2 ready for training exercise. Ghost, Delta 4. Request clarification on signal pattern recognition during high-G maneuvers. She smiled at questions that demonstrated understanding rather than skepticism. These pilots would never know the shame of hesitating when hesitation cost lives, because they were learning to fight with tools she had forged from her own failure. The training exercise lasted 4 hours and concluded with simulated engagement scenarios that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Her students performed electromagnetic target acquisition and coordinated attacks against electronic phantoms with skill levels that would have been considered science fiction before her tactical innovations became standard procedure. During the debrief, Admiral Richardson appeared via encrypted video link from Fleet Headquarters. Ghost, I'm told your students are achieving success rates that exceed performance of veteran squadrons using conventional tactics. They're learning to see with different eyes, sir. Once you understand that stealth technology creates patterns instead of eliminating them, the rest is just mathematics and practice. The Admiral's expression carried the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed tactical evolution in real time. Lieutenant Commander, I'm pleased to inform you that your electronic warfare protocols are being adopted fleet-wide. Additionally, you're being promoted to commander and assigned as Director of Advanced Combat Tactics at the Naval War College. The weight of professional redemption settled on her shoulders like the harness of an ejection seat, substantial, purposeful, and designed to carry her safely through whatever turbulence lay ahead. She had transformed from a pilot who had failed under pressure into the architect of tactics that would define how America's aviators fought for generations to come. That night, she finally finished the letter she had been writing to Lieutenant Chen. The failure that ended our partnership, she wrote, became the foundation for tactics that will protect every pilot who flies these missions. Sometimes falling from the sky teaches you how others can stay airborne. She sealed the letter in an envelope that would join the hundreds of other communications between former wingmen who had learned that some bonds survive even professional catastrophe. The notebook that had once contained only shame and analysis now held the mathematical foundations of electronic warfare doctrine and the personal knowledge that redemption often arrived disguised as opportunity to serve others. Years would pass before military historians would recognize the engagement over the Strait of Hormuz as the moment when aerial combat evolved from visual fighting to mathematical warfare. They would study Vesper's tactics in classrooms, where future pilots learned to navigate electronic chaos with tools she had developed during her lowest professional moment. But that recognition lay in the future. Tonight, she was simply a naval aviator who had learned to fly again after falling, carrying knowledge purchased with failure and refined through service to something larger than personal reputation. The ocean stretched beyond her window, vast and patient, holding challenges that would require new kinds of courage to face. The pen that had once scratched uncertainty onto paper now wrote with the confidence of proven tactics and hard-earned wisdom. Her call sign had evolved from mockery to designation to legend, a transformation that proved sometimes the longest journeys began with a single question mark scribbled in a notebook while others looked away. The sky waited, patient and vast, ready for the next chapter of service. 5 years after the engagement that had changed everything, Commander Vesper Nakamura stood before the graduating class of the Navy's Advanced Combat Tactics School, watching faces that belonged to pilots who would never know a world where electronic warfare wasn't fundamental to survival. Her notebook, now in its fourth iteration, contained tactical innovations that had grown from her original electromagnetic detection methods into comprehensive doctrine, covering everything from drone swarm coordination to quantum radar countermeasures. "Your final exercise," she announced to the 53 aviators who represented the cream of the fleet's pilot corps, "will simulate engagement conditions where conventional tactics fail and electronic warfare dominates the battlefield. You will fight enemies you cannot see using weapons that may not respond to traditional targeting systems." The students looked back at her with expressions that mixed confidence with healthy apprehension. They had spent 18 months learning to think like electronic warfare specialists while flying like fighter pilots, mastering skills that bridged the gap between technical knowledge and combat instinct. Lieutenant Jennifer Phoenix Walsh, daughter of the same Commander Walsh whose rescue had sparked Vesper's tactical revolution, raised her hand with the directness that ran in her family. "Ma'am, rules of engagement for simulated targets that appear to violate physics." "The same rules that apply to any enemy, Lieutenant. You identify them, you engage them, and you complete the mission." Vesper's response carried the weight of someone who had learned these lessons under circumstances where mistakes meant casualties rather than reduced scores. The technology may seem impossible, but the principles of aerial combat remain constant: speed, surprise, and violence of action applied with mathematical precision. The exercise that followed would be remembered as the most complex training scenario in the school's history. Students flew against simulated enemies using adaptive stealth technology, coordinated jamming networks, and electronic warfare capabilities that pushed the boundaries of current threat assessments. But they also flew with tools and tactics that had been developed by someone who understood failure intimately enough to prevent others from experiencing it. When the results were tallied, the graduation class had achieved engagement success rates that exceeded those of veteran combat squadrons facing similar threats. More importantly, they had demonstrated the ability to adapt their tactics in real time as enemy capabilities evolved, a skill that would prove essential in an era where technological advantages shifted as quickly as political allegiances. "Outstanding performance," Admiral Richardson observed during the closing ceremony. He now wore the fourth star of a fleet admiral, his career having benefited from the tactical innovations that had emerged from one pilot's determination to learn from failure. These pilots represent the future of naval aviation, technically proficient, tactically flexible, and mentally prepared for threats we haven't imagined yet. Vesper watched her students receive their certificates with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal catastrophe into institutional wisdom. Each pilot would carry her methods into squadron service, spreading tactics that would protect countless aviators who would never know her name or understand how their survival had been purchased with one woman's shame and determination. That evening, she received a message from Lieutenant Chen, now a full commander serving as executive officer of a training squadron in Alaska. Vesper, saw the news about your promotion to captain. The kids up here are using your electronic warfare protocols and getting results that would have seemed impossible when we were flying together. Proud of what you built from what we broke. She replied simply, built it for everyone who comes next, Marcus, including your students. The promotion ceremony took place 3 months later aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, with representatives from throughout the Pacific Fleet attending to witness the advancement of someone whose tactical innovations had redefined modern aerial warfare. Captain Vesper Nakamura stood at attention, while Admiral Richardson read her citation, words that transformed her from cautionary tale to institutional legend. For outstanding contributions to naval aviation tactics, electronic warfare doctrine, and the development of training protocols that have enhanced combat effectiveness throughout the fleet. The formal language couldn't capture the human cost of the knowledge being honored, but it recognized the value of wisdom earned through failure and refined through service. Her family attended via video link from California, parents who had watched their daughter fall from professional grace and rebuild herself into something stronger than she had been before the failure. Her mother's eyes held the particular pride reserved for children who had found strength in adversity rather than succumbing to shame. After